Washington. Once again, your host, here he is, David Gura.
Charlie, thank you very much. David Gura in for Joe Matthew and Kaylee Lyons here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg Radio and YouTube on this, the 27th day of the federal government shutdown. And I should note, when it comes to SNAP benefits, crucially important to tens of millions of Americans, the Agriculture Department saying federal food aid will not go out starting on November the 1st. About 42 million Americans rely on those benefits. It's one of many pressure points here coming up in short order as this shutdown stretches on. Here to talk to us more about sort of where things stand and where they're going is Nathan Dean, Senior U.S. Policy Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Great to have you with us. I look at those pressure points, what could kind of compel lawmakers to get together with the White House. Of course, the president is overseas. I think of these benefits. I think of the open enrollment period starting. There are calendar events as well, the Veterans Day holiday on the horizon. What is your best forecast or estimate of sort of when we get to a point where conversations begin to take place in earnest and maybe we move to a resolution of this?
So I think you're going to have conversations starting amongst a bipartisan group of senators, call it informal, more chit-chats more than negotiations. I think that starts later this week because I do think there is a real risk here that SNAP benefits could be one of those catalysts that brings individuals back together and says, look, we should at least start talking about a deal. We're not seeing in terms of headline risk for Walmart, Albertsons, and Kroger at the moment. So right now, from a market perspective, SNAP benefits isn't really all that much of an issue, but we're talking about 42 million Americans here. And so certainly I think that's something that we'll be looking at. We'll also be looking at the second military paycheck. President Trump hasn't really said, if they're going to reallocate funds to pay for the military members. That's a pressure point. And third, when do Democrats feel this idea of ACA and open enrollment and these higher premiums, when do the Democrats feel that they can taint Republicans with this message? Because it doesn't sound like there's going to be any type of deal on this anytime soon. So those are the three things that I'm going to be looking for over the next few weeks. And if we don't get into a situation where really much movement happens, then it potentially could go all the way to Thanksgiving. And this idea of a TSA or an air traffic controller sick out, massive gridlock, that's something that could bring Congress back together. But right now, both sides are looking at the polling data and both sides are saying we're good. We had the Transportation Secretary sounding the alarm about how dire things could become. Talk to me about the optics of this, particularly in this place in Washington, D.C. and surrounding areas. You had Don Beyer, the congressman from Virginia's 8th District, out there at a food pantry this weekend, helping get food to furloughed and unpaid federal workers. These are searing images. For those who don't live here in Washington, how is this playing out around the region? How much of a forcing mechanism is that? Just folks hearing from constituents about how bad things have become and are likely to get? So I think there's two ways to look at this. First is the life cycle of a government shutdown. And usually the first stage is blame the other party and continue with your talking points. And because the polling data hasn't really changed, independents are slightly blaming a little bit more of the Republicans than Democrats. But because that polling data hasn't changed and both sides are looking at the same data saying we're good, we're still in stage one of the government shutdown of these talking points. But more importantly, to those of the individuals that are working in the Washington, D.C. area, the government workers and the contractors that are furloughed by this, look, I can tell you anecdotally from the flag football fields, people aren't happy about that. But the problem is that local politics has become national politics and national politics has become local politics. And so when you're looking at this across the entire globe, the government workers aren't really all that much of a resource or at least a pressure point to get Congress to act. And when you're not seeing it in the markets and you're not really seeing it in the economic data at the moment that we get, it's not really a reason for Congress to come together and say negotiate because they still look at the same data and they're still thinking we're good. Readers of Nathan's writing will know great analysis, incisive analysis, but also great updates on flag football, which I appreciate on a week-to-week basis. On these workers, we did hear from the head of a big labor union, the American Federation of Government Employees, Everett Kelly, the president of that union, issued a statement, said both political parties have made their point and still there is no clear end in sight. Today, I'm making mine. It's time to pass a clean continuing resolution and end this shutdown today. No half measures and no gamesmanship. Put every single federal worker back on the job with full back pay today. Of course, there's been some speculation. Maybe there won't be back pay, even though it's mandated by law. The president not coming out and saying that that's a guaranteed thing. How much does this matter, a statement like this from a union head, when it comes to changing the conversation or the
integrity of the conversation on Capitol Hill?
I think it's an opening of the door. And what I mean by that is that, you mentioned Veterans Day holiday, the 11th of November. If we get to a situation where the Democrats, maybe certain Democrats, don't think of leadership, but think of like more of the moderate Democrats that have, elections next year. If we get to a situation where they say, look, what's the end game strategy? And if that strategy is, can we paint these higher ACA premiums on Republicans and say, look, we tried, we battled, we made our points. Now it's on to the GOP's turn to figure out what this is. Maybe that's a way that we can say, okay, let's open the government and let's get these government workers paid as a way of an endgame strategy towards reopening the government. So I think this statement today was important from an opening of the door. It's just another pressure point for Democrats to say, look, the endgame strategy is going to fall on us because the polling data hasn't really changed all that much. And I don't think it's going to, at least within the next few weeks. So I could see some senators, on the more moderate side saying, look, we see the statement coming out. There's going to be more and more calls for this. Maybe we start talking about what that endgame strategy is.
Let me ask you lastly, your Policy Pulse newsletter, not entirely about the shutdown. I should say you went to the Ravens-Bears game. Mm-hmm. Ravens won. I'll note that. That was for readers of the newsletter. But you also write about changes at the Fed when it comes to stress tests. This is a crucial point here. Yes, the shutdown is consuming so much of the city and the work that's happening here. Of course, the Fed continues to operate. We'll get a Fed meeting this week. How big a deal are these new rules when it comes to the stress tests?
So if you talk to an individual bank, and if you talk to like the chief risk officer, the chief compliance officer, this is a big deal. Proposal that came out on Friday, essentially more transparency for stress tests. If you're talking to a bank investor, it's not that big of a deal. Call it a second-tier issue because there's no real change in capital requirements associated with this. It just means that these banks aren't going to really have much of a gotcha issue when the stress tests that come out in June. There'll be more transparency. They'll know what's going into the stress test, so they'll be able to plan accordingly. So if you're on the compliance side or risk side, you're really excited. If you're a bank investor, it's a second-tier issue.
Nathan, great to see you, as always, and I will see you again soon here as the week unfolds. Nathan Dean of Bloomberg Intelligence joining me here in studio in Washington, D.C. And let me